Story number 1. The silent screening. I never believed in ghosts or curses. Growing up in a small Texas town, I prided myself on being practical, relying on facts and logic rather than superstitions. But that changed the night my friends and I stumbled upon the silent screen theater. It was a chilly October evening when Tom, Sarah, Lisa, Mike, and I decided to explore the forgotten corners of our town. Most of our friends had already retreated indoors, sipping pumpkin spice lattes and sharing Halloween plans. We craved adventure, something beyond the mundane routines of our lives. That's when we saw it. A flickering sign partially obscured by overgrown ivy. Silent Screen Theater. The building stood at the edge of town, its facade weathered and peeling. The windows were dusty, the once vibrant marquee now dimmed to a faint glow. Curiosity got the better of us. "Let's check it out," Tom suggested, a mischievous grin on his face. As we approached, the door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit lobby. An old-fashioned ticket booth stood to one side, manned by a tall figure cloaked in a dark coat. His face was obscured by shadows, and he didn't utter a single word as we approached. "For tickets, please," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded slowly, handing us 4 identical tickets with the number 13 printed on them. "Enjoy the show," he murmured before turning away, leaving us in silence. We exchanged puzzled looks but shrugged it off. Maybe it was just an old tradition or a quirky choice by the theater owner. We found our seats in the middle row, each of us settling into the plush, albeit worn, cushions. The screen remained dark for a few moments before the lights dimmed further and the projector whirred to life. The film began innocently enough, classic black and white footage of old movie nights, complete with laughter and applause. But as the minutes ticked by, the scenes shifted. The camera panned across the empty theater, focusing on each seat until it landed on ours. My heart skipped a beat as I watched myself sit down, unaware of the camera's presence. Tom's eyes widened, and Sarah leaned forward, her breath visible in the chilly air. "Guys, that's us," she whispered. I nodded, feeling a strange mix of fear and fascination. The film continued to mirror our actions, ordering popcorn, chatting during the previews, even the way we glanced around the room. It was as if the movie was documenting our exact moments in real time. As the final film rolled, we exchanged uneasy glances. The credits began to play, but instead of names, it listed our names with the date and time we had entered the theater. Confusion turned to panic when we realized the screen was showing our exit from the lobby, despite the doors being sealed shut. "We need to leave," Mike said, standing up abruptly. But when we reached for the door, it was gone. In its place was a solid wall of darkness, impenetrable and cold. "Where the hell are we?" Lisa demanded, her voice trembling. The room grew colder, the temperature dropping rapidly. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch and writhe, whispering our names in a language we couldn't understand. The laughter and applause from the beginning of the film now echoed ominously around us, bouncing off the walls and amplifying our fear. Suddenly, the screen flickered and the image changed. The film now showed the silent screen theater empty, except for one figure standing at the back, a woman in a flowing white dress, her face hidden behind a veil of dark hair. She turned slowly, her eyes meeting mine through the screen, sending a chill down my spine. "Don't you recognize me?" her voice echoed, though no sound emanated from the projector. Her presence was palpable, her sorrow and anger filling the room. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out, taking a step back. The film showed us walking towards her, but every time we tried to approach, she vanished, leaving behind only the haunting echo of her words. The whispers grew louder, surrounding us from all sides, urging us to turn back, to leave the theater and never return. "We need to find another way out," Tom insisted, his voice edged with desperation. But the more we moved, the more disoriented we became. The seats seemed to shift and move, trapping us in an endless maze of corridors and darkened rooms. Every turn led us back to the center of the theater, where the ghostly woman awaited, her presence more menacing with each appearance. As the hours dragged on, our hope dwindled. The whispers became clearer, more insistent. "Don't show the wrong film," they repeated, a dire warning that sent shivers through our bodies. We realized too late that we were part of the theater's eternal loop, destined to reenact our own lives within the cursed film. In a final act of desperation, we huddled together, trying to break free from the nightmare, but the shadows closed in, the ghostly woman rising to her full, terrifying height. Her eyes glowed with an otherworldly light as she reached out to us, her touch freezing us in place. "Stay and be a part of the story," she whispered, her voice now a harmonious blend of sorrow and malice. "Join us in the final reel." With a collective scream, we tried to fight the invisible force, but it was futile. One by one, we were drawn into the film, our lives now just scenes on a never-ending loop. The theater returned to silence, the lights dimming once more, waiting for the next unsuspecting souls to step into seat 13. Years later, the silent screen theater remains a forgotten relic, its doors sealed and its secrets buried under layers of dust and neglect. But sometimes, late at night, passers-by report seeing flickering lights and hearing faint whispers emanating from within, warning all who dare to enter, "Don't show the wrong film." And if you ever find yourself drawn to an old movie theater with a haunting allure, remember our story. Some legends are true, and some seats are better left empty. For in the shadows of the silent screen, there are echoes of the past, trapped forever in a cursed film that claims new victims with every showing. Story number 2. The Last Janitor. I've always been a night owl. While most people in Rosewood, Texas, settled into their beds by 10 p.m., I found solace in the quiet hours when the world seemed to pause. My job as the last janitor at the Grand Oak Theater suited me perfectly. The theater, once the crown jewel of our small town, had seen better days. Now, this grandeur was faded, the seats worn thin from decades of use, and its marquee dimmed to a faint glow that barely pierced the darkness of the night. The Grand Oak was a relic of the past, a place where memories lingered like the scent of old popcorn and mothballs. I took pride in maintaining its aged beauty, ensuring that every creak and groan of the old building was kept in check. But it wasn't just the upkeep that kept me coming back night after night. It was the stories, the whispers of the past that seemed to echo through the empty halls. Every night, after the final show ended and the last patron trickled out, I'd begin my rounds, sweeping the aisles, wiping down the concession stands, and checking the projection room were routine tasks. But there was one area that always gave me the creeps, the last row of seats. For years, I'd heard it, a faint, sneering laughter that seemed to emanate from the back of the theater, long after everyone had left. First, I chalked it up to the acoustics of the old building, or maybe my imagination running wild after too many late nights alone. But the laughter persisted, growing louder and more distinct with each passing week. I couldn't ignore it any longer. One particularly quiet night, as I was mopping the floor near the last row, the laughter started again. It was sharp, mocking, a sound that sent chills down my spine. I froze, my mop slipping from my hands as I strained to listen. The laughter echoed through the empty theater, bouncing off the walls and seats, creating an eerie symphony of sound. My heart pounded in my chest. I decided to investigate, hoping to find a rational explanation. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way toward the back of the theater, each step feeling heavier than the last. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the rows of seats that had witnessed countless stories unfold on the big screen. As I approached the last row, the laughter grew louder, more menacing. It was as if someone, or something, was right there, laughing at my intrusion. I reached the final row, the air growing colder with each step, my breath visible in the frigid air. I scanned the empty seats, searching for any sign of life. That's when I saw him, A man in formal attire sat in the center seat, his back straight and his hands folded neatly on his lap. He wore a tailored suit that seemed out of place in the worn-down theater, and his shoes gleamed even in the dim light. His presence was unnerving, as if he didn't belong in this time or place. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing through the silent theater. He didn't respond. Instead, he let out a deep, mocking laugh, the sound reverberating through the room like a dark omen. I took another step closer, the flashlight beam dancing across his features, only to reveal nothing but shadows. His face was obscured by the dim light, but his eyes, hollow and lifeless, seemed to bore into my very soul. Panic surged through me as I realized he wasn't moving, just sitting there, staring at me with an intensity that was almost painful. I reached out to touch the seat beside him, desperate for some form of contact. But my hand passed through the fabric as if it were made of smoke. The laughter intensified, surrounding me from all sides, closing in like a pack of wolves. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet as the theater seemed to warp around me. The walls stretched and twisted, the seats elongating into grotesque shapes that seemed to reach out toward me. The temperature plummeted, and the air grew thick with the scent of smoke and decay. Desperate to escape, I turned and sprinted toward the entrance, the laughter chasing me every step of the way. But as I reached the door, it vanished, replaced by an impenetrable wall of darkness. I pounded on it, screaming for help, but no sound escaped my lips. The theater had become a labyrinth of terror, each corner hiding shadows that whispered my name. In a last-ditch effort, I made my way back to the projection room, hoping to find some semblance of reality. The room was empty, the projector silent and still. I approached the machine, running my hands over its cold metal surface, when I noticed something on the floor, a single, charred ticket lying amidst the debris. I picked it up, the edges crisp despite its appearance. The date printed on it was from 50 years ago, long before I was born. Confusion and fear mingled in my mind as I realized that the theater was not just haunted by any spirit. It was haunted by someone from the past, someone whose story had been lost to time. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the room filled with the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate steps that seemed to circle the room, never stopping, never slowing. The laughter returned, louder and more distorted, a cacophony of voices that drowned out my own thoughts. I backed away, clutching the ticket tightly, when the man in the suit reappeared. His eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a pull, an invisible force dragging me toward him. "Don't," I whispered, trying to fight against the invisible chains. But it was no use. He stood up, his movements slow and deliberate, and reached out a hand that seemed to absorb the light around it. "Don't show the wrong film," he whispered, his voice a haunting melody that echoed in my mind. With a final surge of willpower, I broke free from his grasp, stumbling backward as the theater shifted once more. The walls contracted, the seats folding in on themselves, and the darkness threatened to consume me. I ran, my legs burning with effort, until I found myself back at the entrance. The door was gone, replaced by a mirror that reflected my terrified face back at me. I glanced down and saw the charred ticket clutched in my hand, his presence a stark reminder of what I'd witnessed. The laughter faded, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed in on me from all sides. Exhausted and broken, I collapsed to the floor, the weight of the experience sinking in. The Grand Oak Theater stood silent once more, the secrets buried beneath layers of dust and time. I knew I had to leave, to escape the nightmare that had unfolded before me. But even as I stumbled out into the cold night air, the memory of the man in the suit lingered, a chilling reminder that some stories never truly end. They just wait for the next unwitting victim to become part of their eternal loop. Months have passed since that night, but the experience remains etched in my mind like a scar that refuses to fade. The Grand Oak Theater still stands in Rosewood, its windows reflecting the flickering lights of passing cars. but now I avoid it, especially seat 13. The laughter, the shadows, the charred ticket, they haunt my dreams. A constant reminder of the thin veil between our world and the unknown. Sometimes, when the wind howls just right and the moon casts long shadows across the empty streets, I can almost hear the laughter again, echoing from the depths of the theater. And I can't help but wonder how many others have fallen victim to the curse of seat 13, trapped forever in a cycle of fear and despair. If you ever find yourself near the Grand Oak Theater in Rosewood, heed my warning. Respect the legends, honor the memories of those who came before, and tread carefully, for in the heart of darkness, amidst the flickering lights and silent seats, lies a presence that watches, waits, and guards its domain with a vigilance that can turn a simple night at the movies into a nightmare you can't escape. Story number 3. The Cursed Reel. I never believed in ghosts. Growing up in a small town, I prided myself on being practical, relying on facts and logic rather than superstitions. But that changed the night I found the reel. I managed the Grand Oak Theater, an old movie house nestled in the heart of our sleepy town. The theater had seen better days, its once vibrant marquee now dimmed and peeling, the seats worn thin from decades of use. It was my responsibility to keep it running, preserving its legacy while trying to breathe new life into its aging infrastructure. One rainy Tuesday evening, as I was closing up after the last show, I noticed something unusual. On the first seat of the projection room, amidst the scattered popcorn kernels and forgotten soda cans, lay a dusty film reel. It wasn't part of our regular inventory, no label, no markings, nothing to indicate its origin. Curiosity piqued. I picked it up, feeling the weight of the unknown in my hands. Maybe it's leftover from an old batch. I mused aloud, inspecting the reel. There was something almost eerie about its presence, a silent invitation to uncover its secrets. Despite my reservations, I decided to give it a chance. After all, it was just another film reel, and tonight was too slow to worry about superstitions. Back in the projection room, I loaded the mysterious reel into the projector. The machine whirred to life, the familiar hum soothing in its predictability. The screen flickered, and the film began to play. First, it was just empty rows of seats, the projector light casting long shadows across the theater. The scene was serene, almost hypnotic in its simplicity. But then, something changed. The camera slowly panned upward, and I felt a chill run down my spine as the lens focused on me, the person sitting in front of the screen. I stared in disbelief, my reflection merging with the film's image. My heart raced as I realized the film was recording my every move, capturing me in real time. It felt like staring into a mirror that was alive, watching my every action with an unsettling precision. Before I could react, the lights in the theater began to flicker. The room grew colder, the temperature dropping suddenly as if the air itself was thickening. I glanced around, trying to make sense of what was happening. The projector sputtered, and the screen went blank, plunging the room into darkness. A low rumble echoed through the theater, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and unmistakably close. My breath quickened as I strained to hear over the growing storm outside. The footsteps seemed to circle the room, their origin unclear, as if someone or something was pacing just beyond the reach of the flickering lights. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. "Is someone there?" No response. The footsteps continued, now accompanied by a faint whispering that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Words were indistinct, but the tone was unmistakably menacing, filled with sorrow and anger. I felt a presence behind me, a heaviness that pressed against my back, making it difficult to turn around. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, but my legs felt rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. The whispers grew louder, forming coherent words that sent shivers down my spine. "Don't show the wrong film." Panic surged through me as I fumbled for the reel. desperate to reverse the situation. My fingers trembled as I tried to eject it, but the projector refused to comply. The film had a mind of its own, unwilling to let go of the darkness it had unleashed. Suddenly, the screen flickered back to life, and there I was again, captured in the film's eerie embrace. The presence behind me intensified, the air thick with a malevolent energy that seemed to seep into my very bones. I could feel eyes watching me, their gaze piercing through the darkness, judging, condemning. Desperation took hold. I grabbed the reel and yanked it from the projector, sending it clattering to the floor. The film ceased, the screen going dark once more. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and an oppressive silence settled over the theater. I stood there, heart pounding, trying to catch my breath, the remnants of fear still clinging to me like a shroud. But the relief was short-lived. The projector, now seemingly abandoned, began to emit a high-pitched screech, the sound unbearable. The room seemed to warp around me, the walls closing in as the temperature plummeted further. Shadows lengthened and twisted, taking on grotesque forms that danced at the edges of my vision. A figure materialized in the darkness, a woman in a flowing white dress, her face obscured by long, tangled hair. She moved towards me with an unnatural grace, her presence both beautiful and terrifying. Her eyes, visible through the darkness, were hollow voids that seemed to draw me in, threatening to consume me whole. "Why?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely a whisper. "Why are you here?" She stopped inches from me, her breath cold against my skin. "You shouldn't have played the film," she whispered, her voice echoing in the confined space. "Now you're part of it." Before I could react, the room erupted into chaos. The walls melted away, revealing an endless expanse of darkness and ice. The theater transformed into an otherworldly landscape, the seats stretching out into oblivion, and the screen a gateway to a frozen abyss. The woman reached out, her fingers like tendrils of shadow, pulling me toward the screen. I struggled, fighting against the invisible force that threatened to drag me into the film's cursed narrative. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, drowning out my thoughts with their haunting plea. "Don't show the wrong film." Summoning every ounce of strength, I pushed against the darkness, breaking free from the woman's grasp. The theater snapped back to reality, the lights flickering on as if nothing had happened. The air warmed instantly, the oppressive weight lifting from my shoulders. The reel lay abandoned on the floor, this film dormant once more. Breathing heavily, I stumbled out of the projection room, my mind racing to comprehend what had just occurred. I knew I had to destroy the cursed reel, to prevent it from claiming another victim. With trembling hands, I grabbed a metal pipe and smashed the reel, watching as the film unraveled and disintegrated into dust. As the last remnants of the film faded away, a sense of peace settled over the theater. The whispers ceased, and the footsteps were gone, leaving behind only the faint echo of my own footsteps in the silent room. I locked the theater that night, vowing never to let the Grand Oak fall into the hands of those who would tamper with the unknown. The Grand Majestic stood as a testament to resilience, its haunted past now a story of survival rather than fear. But sometimes, when the night is still and the wind whispers through the broken windows, I catch a glimpse of her in the reflection of the projector, her hollow eyes watching, waiting, guarding the secrets of the Grand Oak Theater. And I remember the warning she gave me, a chilling reminder that some films are better left unwatched, and some stories are too dark to be told. If you ever find yourself wandering near an old theater in a forgotten town, beware the seats that remain empty, respect the legends, honor the memories of those who came before, and tread carefully, for in the shadows of the past, there are echoes of sorrow and whispers of warning, guarding their domain with a vigilance that can turn a simple night at the movies into a nightmare you can't escape. Story number 4. The back room behind the projector. When I took the job as a projectionist at the old Orion Theater, I wasn't looking for much, just a paycheck, a quiet place to work, and a chance to enjoy my evenings away from the chaos of my regular life. The theater itself was a relic of the past, a crumbling Art Deco building that had somehow survived decades of neglect, with its creaking seats, flickering neon sign, and the faint, lingering scent of popcorn and mildew. I'd always loved old movie theaters, and the Orion felt like it was frozen in time. There was something comforting about the hum of the projector, the soft murmur of the audience, and the way the light danced across the faded red curtains. But beneath its charm, the theater held a shadow, a secret that I would have been better off not discovering. The job itself was simple enough. Start the projector, monitor the film, and shut everything down at the end of the night. My boss, Mr. Elkins, was an older man who had run the theater for decades. He was gruff but kind, the type who spoke in short sentences and didn't tolerate nonsense. "You're up in the booth," he told me on my first day. "Keep the reels running smooth, don't mess with the equipment, and don't go poking around where you don't belong." At the time, I didn't think much of it. Every old building has its quirks, and the Orion was no exception. The projector booth was cramped and dusty, with stacks of film reels and an ancient chair that groaned under my weight. The walls were covered in faded posters of movies long forgotten, their edges curling with age. It was during my second week on the job that I found the door. I'd been cleaning the booth after the last show of the night when I noticed it. A small, inconspicuous door tucked away in the corner, half hidden behind a stack of film canisters. The paint on it was chipped, and the handle was tarnished, but it looked functional. Curious, I tugged it open. Behind the door was a narrow staircase, the steps steep and uneven, descending into the darkness below. The air that wafted up was cold and stale, carrying the faint, metallic tang of decay. I hesitated, glancing back at the projector room, as if expecting someone to stop me. But the theater was silent, the audience long gone, and my curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way down the stairs, the sound of my footsteps muffled by the thick dust that coated everything. At the bottom, I found another door, this one heavier and more ornate, with intricate carvings etched into the wood. It looked completely out of place, like it had been stolen from an old cathedral. When I pushed it open, I stepped into a room that made my stomach twist. The room was filled with shelves, each one crammed with film canisters of varying sizes and states of decay. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a sickly yellow light over the scene. In the center of the room stood a projector, ancient and rusted, its lens cracked and its reels empty. Beside it was a stack of dusty film reels labeled with dates, some going back as far as the 1930s. But what drew my attention was the screen. It was mounted on the far wall, the fabric torn in places, yet pristine in others. On the screen, an image flickered, a black and white scene of a theater much like the Orion. The seats were filled with people, their faces shadowed and indistinct, their movements slow and unnatural. As I watched, I realized they weren't watching the film, they were staring at the screen itself. At me. I stumbled back, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The figures on the screen didn't move, but their presence felt suffocating, their hollow gazes boring into me. I turned off the projector and fled, my heart pounding as I slammed the heavy door shut behind me. I tried to convince myself that I'd imagined it, that the old projector was malfunctioning, or that the stress of the new job was playing tricks on my mind. But the unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. A week later, it happened again. It was a slow night, the theater nearly empty save for a handful of patrons scattered among the seats. I was halfway through the final reel when I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from below. At first, I thought it was the sound of the old pipes, but the tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it became clear that it was coming from the hidden door. I froze, my eyes locked on the corner of the room where the door lay hidden. The tapping stopped, replaced by a faint, raspy whisper that seemed to seep through the cracks. "Don't open the door." The voice was low and distorted, barely louder than a breath. But it sent a chill down my spine. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't move. My feet rooted to the spot as the whispering continued. "Don't show the wrong film." The projector sputtered, and the film reel jammed, throwing the screen into chaos. The audience below murmured in confusion, their voices rising as the room filled with the acrid smell of burning celluloid. I scrambled to fix it, my hands shaking as I replaced the damaged reel with a backup. When the film resumed, I glanced at the hidden door, half expecting it to burst open. Didn't, but that night, when I returned to the booth to clean up, I found the door ajar. Inside, the air was colder than before, and the faint scent of smoke lingered in the stairwell. I descended cautiously, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The heavy door at the bottom stood open, its carvings seeming to twist and writhe in the dim light. The projector in the room was running, casting a grainy image onto the torn screen. This time, the scene was different. It showed the audience below, the patrons who had watched the final screening of the night. But they weren't alone. Behind them, in the shadows, sat rows of figures, their faces obscured but their presence unmistakable. As I watched, one of the figures turned to look directly at the camera, directly at me. The screen flickered, and the image changed. It now showed the projector booth, empty save for a single shadowy figure standing where I was, his head tilted slowly, as though listening to something just out of earshot. The whispers returned, louder now. "Don't show the wrong film." I ran. I didn't lock the door, didn't clean up, didn't even turn off the lights. I drove home shaking, the words echoing in my mind. The next day, I called in sick. A week later, I quit without explanation. I never returned to the Orion Theater, but the memories of that backroom haunt me still. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear the tapping, the faint whispers drifting through the silence. And every time I hear them, I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't opened that door, if I hadn't dared to see what lay behind the projector. Story number 5. The Ghost of Seat 13. I'd heard the stories growing up in Rosewood, Texas, a sleepy little town where everyone knew each other's business and the past clung to the present like cobwebs in an old attic. The old Grand Majestic Theater was the heart of our small community, its marquee a reminder of the golden age of cinema. But it wasn't the charm or nostalgia that made it famous. It was Seat 13. The stories were always the same. Those who sat in Seat 13 in the middle row reported feeling uneasy, as though someone was watching them. Some claimed to see a woman in a white dress sitting beside them, her face hidden behind a veil of dark hair. When the lights came up, she would be gone, leaving behind the acrid smell of smoke and a small, charred mark on the cushion. People whispered that the seat was cursed, that it had something to do with a fire that had gutted the theater decades ago. But no one knew for sure. When I was a kid, I'd never been brave or stupid enough to sit in Seat 13. The stories were enough to keep me away, even if they were just tales meant to scare people. But as I got older, my curiosity grew. By the time I hit my 20s and started writing for the Rosewood Gazette, I figured it was time to confront the legend head-on. After all, what better way to make a name for myself than to solve one of the town's most enduring mysteries? The theater's current owner, Mr. Calhoun, was a wiry man in his 60s who had been running the place since before I was born. He was more than happy to let me poke around, though he made it clear he didn't believe in the ghost stories. "It's all nonsense," he said, shaking his head as he led me through the dimly lit lobby. "Seat 13's no different than any other. People just like a good scare." "Then why don't you sell tickets for it anymore?" I asked, pointing to the faded sign at the box office window. "Seat 13 unavailable." He hesitated, his smile faltering. "Superstition's a powerful thing," he said finally. "If people believe something's cursed, it might as well be." That didn't satisfy me, but I let it slide. I had bigger plans for the night. I came back after the last show ended, armed with a notebook, a recorder, and a flashlight. Mr. Calhoun let me in with a shrug and a warning. "Don't scare yourself silly," he said before locking the door behind me. The theater was eerily silent, its grandeur muted in the dim light of the emergency exit signs. The seats loomed like rows of ghosts, their fabric worn and faded. Seat 13 stood out immediately, its cushion slightly darker than the others, as though it had been burned and hastily repaired. I sat down, the springs creaking under my weight. The air felt colder here, heavier, as though the space around me was holding its breath. I turned on my recorder and began taking notes, describing the room, the atmosphere, the way the shadows seemed to shift at the edges of my vision. An hour passed. Nothing happened. I started to feel foolish, like a kid who'd stayed up too late waiting for Santa Claus. I decided to call it a night, but as I reached for my flashlight, I felt it, a presence beside me. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end as a chill ran down my spine. I turned slowly, my heart pounding. She was there. She sat perfectly still, her white dress glowing faintly in the dim light. Her head was tilted slightly downward, her face obscured by long, dark hair that hung in limp strands. Her hands rested in her lap, pale and motionless. The smell of smoke filled the air, sharp and acrid, making my eyes water. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I could only stare as she slowly turned her head toward me, her movements unnaturally fluid, like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. I wanted to run, to scream, but my body refused to obey. Her face was hidden behind her hair, but I could feel her eyes on me, piercing through the veil like cold steel. She raised one hand, her fingers curling into a beckoning gesture. "Leave," she whispered, her voice low and raspy, like the crackling of burning wood. "This is not your place." The lights flickered, and the room seemed to warp around me, the shadows deepening and twisting like living things. The smell of smoke grew stronger, suffocating, and I realized the seat beneath me was growing warm. Too warm. I bolted upright, stumbling into the aisle. The figure remained seated, her head tilted once more toward the screen as though I no longer existed. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran, my footsteps echoing through the empty theater as the smell of burning fabric followed me like a shadow. When I reached the lobby, I collapsed against the wall, gasping for air. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the recorder as I stopped the tape. I didn't look back. Couldn't. The thought of seeing her again, of her watching me, was too much to bear. The next morning, I returned with Mr. Calhoun. I needed to know if what I'd seen was real, if there was any evidence of her presence. We walked down the aisle together, our footsteps slow and cautious. When we reached seat 13, he stopped and let out a low whistle. The cushion was charred, a blackened mark spreading across its center. The smell of smoke still lingered, faint but unmistakable. "I'll be damned," he muttered, crossing himself. Guess the stories weren't just stories after all. I never sat in seat 13 again. I never returned to the Grand Majestic. Though I heard the stories continued, people seeing her, smelling the smoke, finding the burned cushion in the morning. Some say she's the ghost of a woman who died in the fire that gutted the theater in the 1940s, trapped in her seat as the flames consumed the building. Others believe she's something older, something darker, drawn to the pain and fear left behind. I don't know what she is, but I know this: she's still there, waiting in the shadows of the old theater, watching from seat 13. And if you're foolish enough to sit beside her, you'll see her too. But be warned, she doesn't like company.